I think for anyone who actually agrees with those agendas and finds themselves in sympathy with the National Trust, which is probably not the audience here, but just generally, I would say, actually, well, have you seen how the National Trust is not even doing its core purposes properly?
Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Catherine Bennett.
And I'm Mark Lambert.
And I'm delighted to welcome somebody who is a friend of mine, but not just that, a former student of mine and a wonderful young woman with many hats on, which I'll mention a few here. Zewditu Gebreyohanes, who is a trustee at the V&A Museum, which is the Victoria and Albert Museum. You're editor of your own custodian Substack and deputy editor of the History Reclaimed online publication. Have I given you all your proper titles there, Zewditu?
Thank you very much. Yes, kind introduction. Lovely to be with you here today.
Well, I'm delighted you could join us. And the reason I invited you is because you and I met a few years ago after some time had passed following the end of your schooling. It was at a National Conservative conference and I suddenly heard Miss and turned around and it was you. And so we reconnected and you told me about some of your work involved with the Restore Trust project, which it was about restoring faith in the National Trust. And just recently, we reported that a Christian film production company wanted to film some of their documentary through a National Trust property and they were refused entry. So that's why I've invited you on to talk with us today. But we do have there's a large American audience and not everybody will be familiar with the National Trust. So can we begin by telling us what the National Trust is?
Well, the National Trust is a charity. It's a huge organisation that looks after Britain's natural and built heritage. It was founded in 1894 with very charitable objectives. It technically wasn't a charity until the mid-20th century, but it was there to preserve these places for the enjoyment of the public forever. And it was then, this purpose was enshrined in statute and later in charitable law when it became a charity. And the National Trust, which is a wonderful organisation, has sadly in recent years been straying somewhat from these original purposes and engaging in some slightly irrelevant activity and not doing to a sort of high standard what it was meant to be doing in the first place.
Straying somewhat is an understatement. I think if anyone watching is familiar with the trajectory of the National Trust. And so for a while you were director of Restore Trust. So tell us a bit about what this is.
Well, Restore Trust was a campaign that was set up a few years ago when a group of members saw the direction in which the National Trust was going and thought something needed to be done about it. The chairwoman is someone called Cornelia van der Pol, who was the one who really started it up. I was the director for a year and a half, and it was an incredibly eye-opening experience, just listening to the volunteers and the members, people who had been involved in one form or another with the organisation, and just hearing about the ways in which they'd been sidelined by the National Trust management, the ways their views were not being taken into account. And then myself, I got first-hand experience of this when I saw how the National Trust was over time rigging its elections. It had never been a perfect democracy, but that's one thing. But for the supposedly inclusive, we care about you National Trust management to then be stifling any sort of dissent and trying to quash dissenting voices was disheartening, I think. I thought that there would be more potential for us to work with the National Trust management, but it seemed like all they wanted to hear was sort of praise rather than constructive criticism.
It sounds like it became tyrannical or has become somewhat tyrannical.
Especially with the introduction of the quick vote, which is the option that comes up at the top of the ballot form as of a couple of years ago, which says which invites members to tick the box and then automatically approve the National Trust management's recommendations on how to vote, which is completely undemocratic and has led to more than half of votes being cast using quick vote, in line with the National Trust recommendations. The National Trust already had recommendations. If members wanted to follow the recommendations, it was very easy to do that without having a sort of insidious top voting option, which I think anybody who believes in democracy would be totally against if it happened in a general election, for example.
And Zewditu, tell us some of the worst stories that I've heard a few, and I'm quite shocked by them, to be honest. I was familiar with some, and then others came out. There's a big agenda-driven kind of push, isn't there, in the National Trust, where I think some staff were told they must wear rainbow lanyards, LGBT pins. Yes. Then some of the historic houses have had, like, you visit them, but you're guided through a sort of LGBT lens. So, for example, the owner of this house was homosexual, and even great figures in history and in literature, such as Jane Austen, you have to look at Jane Austen through a gay lens, and this is kind of pushed, isn't it? I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but this is happening, isn't it? Not only that, but slavery. The irony is they're the National Trust, and yet a lot of what they're pushing is about being ashamed of our past, of our colonial past, and also they've jumped, of course, on the bandwagon of climate change. So it feels like you can't visit a National Trust property without being smacked around the face with some kind of agenda.
Yes, I completely agree. I think there has been a lot of driving of agendas at the National Trust. It's important to note that it's not alone among the heritage bodies in doing so, and it's largely a result of the funding incentives that the state funding bodies have been giving these institutions. So it's important to understand that the blame does go one step back. But if we had a proper board of trustees who are committed to their statutory and charitable duties, we wouldn't actually see this happening, even if the incentives are there. So I think, yes, we have some examples you've stated already. The slavery report was a very big, very controversial example, which I think got a lot of members behind the Restore Trust movement. The problem with it was less that the National Trust was mentioning slavery than that they were doing it, as you were saying, due to the agenda. It wasn't to have better history, because they didn't use proper historians, they didn't use qualified people to write it, and as a result we had a very shoddy interim report. By the way, the real one has never been published. The National Trust has not responded to the FOI on how much it cost to produce this interim report, and all it did was sully the reputation of a lot of people who had kindly bequeathed their properties, or the ancestors of the people who had bequeathed their properties to the National Trust. So I think they go about things in a very, even if we give them the benefit of the doubt on the decolonization stuff, that they're just trying to increase people's understanding of history, they're going about it in the worst possible way for one of the biggest heritage preservation organization in Europe, which has great, huge funds. It could employ the best historians if it really wanted a proper, balanced, accurate history. When it comes to other agendas, such as the LGBT stuff, I do think it's very odd that you would be requiring volunteers who are giving freely of their time to open these properties to the public, that you would require them to do something that's controversial in a country that's still at least nominally Christian, is incredibly odd and definitely should never happen. They did row back in the initial Fellbrick Hall one. The National Trust management did row back because of how much public outrage it got. Telling volunteers that they must wear a rainbow lanyard or they'll be relegated to the back rooms is so offensive, I think, to civil liberties, that a lot of people of whatever stripe thought that was definitely something wrong for the National Trust to be doing. However, they have just carried on doing similar things at other sites, and perhaps not in quite the same way, but certainly, as you're saying, offending families by bringing up some sort of tenuous link that there could have been between someone and some other person. Just the way they've been doing it is very it's a very odd way of inserting your own agenda into properties that were meant to be there for the enjoyment of the public. And I think you sort of touched on that there with the trying to make people ashamed bit, especially with the colonization stuff. You're not, the National Trust doesn't exist to make people feel guilty or feel bad about themselves, and nor should someone, about something that perhaps their ancestors did 300 years ago, perhaps they didn't. But they should be making visitors enjoy their experience, or trying to the best of their ability. By the way, I think that often in all of this, what's overlooked is that the National Trust isn't doing as good a job as it used to be with the physical conservation of their places. You only need to go to Sherborne Brook in Gloucestershire, or Barrington Court, to see the sort of managed decline that's going on at a lot of National Trust sites. And often, as with Sherborne Brook, the excuse that's given after many years, that's been given after many years of letting these beautiful ornamental lakes silt up and things, is suddenly now that they're rewilding the place, which seems a very convenient excuse after they've neglected it for very many years. So there are lots of things, I think, for anyone who actually agrees with those agendas and finds themselves in sympathy with the National Trust, which is probably not the audience here, but just generally, I would say, actually, well, have you seen how the National Trust is not even doing its core purposes properly?
There are repercussions as well for social cohesion across the board, aren't there? Like that. Yeah. This is denigrating our cultural heritage, yes, and sort of making it sound like we've got nothing to be proud of.
Yes. No, I completely understand. I completely agree. It's not what you would expect of a top British heritage institution, and one that you want other institutions that they used to look up to and think this is the way we should be heading. As I said, it's such a huge and well-endowed organisation that you would expect better from it.
And really, all you're advocating for is proper history, isn't it?
Proper history. Well, I think chiefly, first and foremost, and I think the National Trust sees it as useful, by the way, that we've been focusing on the colonization or the other controversial things, because it gets them off the topic of you're not actually even doing your core job properly. So I would say first and foremost, proper preservation. So that should be their number one priority. Then, because history is actually an additional thing that's nowhere in the statutory or charitable objects. If you are going to do history, it must be done incredibly well with the best historians. No agenda in there. You're not trying to sully someone's reputation or big them up. You're just giving the facts there, and then the reader or the visitor can make up their mind. And don't insert random agendas, even if it gives you 10,000 or 20,000 in grant money. I think that's in a nutshell is what I'd be advocating for.
We're seeing it across the culture though at the moment, aren't we? Is that, like educators are teaching young people what they should think, instead of how to think. And like, how did you manage to avoid that? How have you, as a younger person, Catherine, getting on a bit.
Yeah.
How have you managed to find that objectivity? And like, obviously, I'm a father with several children, and we have to have regular conversations. But it's obvious to me the pressure coming from school to believe these agendas, so that the kids come home with this agenda, and then you have to sort of take it apart objectively and say, okay, but let's have a look at what really went on. How did you manage to avoid that yourself?
Yeah, don't overlook the role of a very good teacher.
Well, no, exactly. Well, I was going to come on to the teacher. Before we come on to the teacher, though, parents, of course, which you just touched on, are very, very important. Are very important to giving you a strong foundation. I was very lucky to grow up in a family where we had faith, which I think it's not necessarily vital. It's not necessarily, a must, but I think it's incredibly helpful for giving you a strong bedrock anchor. I'm Ethiopian Orthodox Christian, and we grew up in a family that had that faith, and I suppose we grew up in a small C conservative household, and that sort of helps. And you grow up with these common sense ideas. I was also home educated until the age of 10, which helps. And again, I think, frankly, if you've been growing up with just common sense ideas because your parents aren't going to be telling you something incredibly weird on a day-to-day basis, you just inside, you will always, whenever someone's trying to counter that common sense that's been entrenched in you, you'll think much more critically. So I think that was a big factor.
That's really interesting. Parents as the first educators, because that's the opposite of what we're being told. Over and over again through media and the government at the moment, is that I think there was something on the news this morning, which was that schools are the safe place. Homes are where dangerous things happen and dangerous ideas are spread.
But this is part of the narrative, which is actually part of the tyranny, which we see more broadly, outsourcing to so-called experts. I mean, just this week we saw news that they're thinking of scrapping jury trials. We don't need common people. We just need experts like David Lammy. But they're everywhere. It's trust the experts, and then this wonderful news that they've got more money now to get your kids into breakfast club at school. And then they interviewed some parents. What will you do with your time? And there was mums going, I'm going to go for a coffee with my friends. I'm going to clean the house. And you just think, what? Why aren't you saying, if you want to give us money to buy cereal and sit at home with our children and spend time with them. Everything is about get the kids into the clutches of the state. And I know that we're talking about National Trust, but they're not unconnected, are they?
I don't think they're unconnected at all. And it's worth noting that the National Trust have been getting rid of a lot of their much older staff, much more experienced staff, and getting in people who are more in line with their way of thinking, which of course links into all of this. And what I was saying earlier about the taking one step back and looking at the funding bodies, I have a lot of questions to be asking the people who are at all levels of these funding bodies deciding how these funds should be allocated, because the National Trusts always make a big thing out of not being government funded, and they're not technically, and they're unlinked to government, apart from the fact that they should be accountable to Parliament. But they do take a lot of government money, and a lot of those things, if you look at them, and I went through them in my recent report for the Prosperity Institute, which I had a whole section called "Follow the Money," which shows how actually that a lot of this is being led by the financial incentives, and the people who started this were those 2010s managerial sort of people who came into all of the different institutions. But the people they hired down below to carry this out are people who are in line with this way of thinking, which perhaps they wouldn't have been were it not for the things we were just discussing.
It absolutely confounds me. What is the end game here? What are they trying to achieve? The total destruction of our society? Like, that might seem a bit hyperbolic, but that it does seem to be it's about breaking down the structures and introducing sort of new progressive ideas that don't really lead to any kind of social cohesion, do they? Or factual reality, not even to mention that.
No. Well, it's social cohesion is a very big thing. It's also odd that they're alienating their core audience. So the people who are bequeathing money, the people who are thinking of potentially leaving a property to the National Trust or money in their will, or, the people who are volunteering there, they're all being alienated by the National Trust's current trajectory. It's worth noting that volunteer numbers have dropped from 65,000 just a few years ago to under 40,000 now, which has not been reported in the press. It's completely ridiculous and shows up how it's not just a bunch of cranks like Restore Trust, which is actually several tens of thousands of ex-members, volunteers, current members, including me. it's very much a big issue that's affecting the trust. And you wouldn't have shut off, you wouldn't have properties closed to the public or entire floors shut off or entire wings of buildings shut off if you didn't have a volunteer problem, because the volunteers are the backbone of the trust.
Yeah, you do wonder if they care at all, because it's a bit, you hear in Hollywood that they produce these films that are very agenda driven and they flop. And when asked about them, they say, oh, we don't care if they flop. We're happy to take a loss because it's more important to push the ideology. If we can just jump quickly to the story that gained our interest last week as a Christian podcast, as a Catholic podcast, is the fact that a friend of ours, in fact, Christian Holden, a UK-based Catholic filmmaker, wanted to record this documentary called The Way of St. Cuthbert, following a US university professor and his students along the saint's historic path from Melrose Abbey to Lindisfarne. He applied for permission from the National Trust. He sought permission just to visit where St. Cuthbert's body was laid in 875 AD. However, the National Trust declined the request. Bear in mind that people wander up and down there all the time with their iPhones anyway, but he correctly asked for permission to film there. Yeah. And they cited a policy against filming with religious affiliation. In light of what we've all just been discussing for the past 15 minutes, were you shocked by this?
Well, I think what's shocking is the way the National Trust, and this is not a new thing at all, but the National Trust management have double standards when it comes to things that are in their interests or linked to one of the various agendas they're trying to drive, and when it's something that does not align with that. And unfortunately, this thing came up. Any Christian project does not align with the National Trust's current way of thinking, and it's odd, because given that the National Trust is about preserving British heritage, and Britain is, as we said earlier, a Christian country, what could possibly have been controversial about somebody making a documentary about St. Cuthbert and wanting to include some visuals from a place that has strong links to him? And at the same time, the National Trust have been doing things that are objectively controversial, because not all people, Britain is not an LGBT country, or it's not Britain is a Christian country, but there are people who are not Christian but know, because it's a fact, that it is a Christian country. So there's nothing controversial about that. But there are, pursuing all sorts of agendas, all sorts of different agendas, and then not allowing the one that's the most uncontroversial is very odd. And yeah, I think I can't think really how they would justify that if they were asked about all the other much more controversial stuff they've been doing.
It's so frustrating, because you kind of feel like as we go on, and all these different ideas are introduced, all the like the identity politics sort of things, that really all they do is fracture up our society, and make it feel as if other people, minorities, basically have got a greater claim on freedom and all these different things, democracy, than the broad majority, which does nothing really to sort of build our country. And it's very difficult. Obviously, as we're all Christians, so we very much see that as being the best way, the bedrock to build our society, and that is what has built Western society to something that we can all be proud of, isn't it?
And it's social cohesion is such a big thing that one would have expected that in this time of fraught identity politics, that's, I would say, causing societal regression from a time when a short-lived time when everyone, regardless of skin color or whatever, it was a true meritocracy. Now we have completely regressed in the opposite direction, which I would argue is very patronizing. What, just because my name sounds different, or because my skin is very, very slightly darker than someone else, should I have a better chance of getting somewhere if I don't have the qualifications? Or things like that? Or in this particular case, do I need to have plaques everywhere saying, slavery was evil, in order for me to be able to go to these sites? The most ironic thing for me is that the National Trust bang on about inclusivity as long as it helps their own, helps get the grant money. But they have been, with regards to the only tangible barrier to entry, that this sort of hypothetical single mum from Brixton with 3 kids, membership prices have been going up way above inflation. So there are ways that you could, if you genuinely cared about trying to increase access, which frankly I would be all for, if they were trying to bring more people in and that was it, then I think there would be, there are lots of constructive things one could do without harping on about various agendas and things like that. Parking prices have gone up, entry prices, just sort of day passes have gone up, membership prices have gone up, the price of food is completely ridiculous even as the quality is going down. And all of this is happening while the National Trust's management and the top bosses are increasing their own salaries by quite a lot. The Director General is on way above 200,000. This is not what you would expect of a charity. It's not the way you would expect them to be run.
Yeah, it's very worrying, isn't it?
Well, look, Zewditu, we're knocking on a bit, sort of 50. We're looking behind us at 50, but you're not. You're a young woman. We know that the National Trust is populated largely by elderly folk and yummy mummies, mums with babies who can afford to go. And of course, no one's having babies anymore. So, what do you see the outlook? What's the outlook at 10 years from now? The National Trust, is it sort of falling into disrepair and will not exist? What will happen to all these stately homes, or do you see a thirst, a hunger amongst your generation to restore trust and to be involved?
Well, I hope that we'll see some sort of change in leadership, change in leadership at the National Trust, which will allow all those stifled members of staff, volunteers to return and restore it to what it was, which shouldn't be a difficult task, but with the current management, I think that's going to be impossible in the immediate future. With the way things are going, it looks like the public has had more than enough of equality, diversity and inclusion and those sorts of initiatives, and has seen through the through the lies and the yes, that's what I was thinking of. But the thing is, it's always been that the people who are interested in heritage are slightly more traditional minded, tend to be older, so we'll get there, our generation will get there, but it's always going to be the slightly more traditional minded ones who are interested. So as long as they carry on tarnishing British history or trying to not looking after the heritage properly and putting forward all their different agendas, it's going to make the National Trust unfashionable among the sorts of people who might have thought this is for me. Yeah.
And the work you've done has seen real results, hasn't it? With Kew Gardens, I know, and on Churchill, the reports that you've produced have made these institutions drop their weird agendas. The Kew Gardens one was particularly interesting, I thought.
It was so strange. It was strange to be trying to decolonize plants. I mean, what on earth are you talking about? I think they had to drop it because they wouldn't have had a single answer to what decolonizing plants means. But yes, that was satisfying.
Are we any the wiser? I often think this is total Fruit Loop sort of territory. I remember in schools when they were decolonizing the curriculum, and I think I asked what did it mean. No one could ever actually answer what it meant. And there's you want to talk about history. Where's the abolitionist movement? Where's Britain's role in abolishing slavery? Why is it always about how we're oppressors and should be ashamed?
Well, that's what I mean. If someone wanted to do a very academic report on, I'm not saying they should do this, but if they had really wanted to do an academic report on the links between slavery and National Trust properties, there would have been a lot of abolitionist history in there, and then there would have been links to people who had plantations, but you wouldn't have been resorting to the second wife of the, you know, the first husband of the second wife of the owner of this property had a plantation. I mean, who cares? That's you know, it's when you get to those incredibly tenuous links that you start to think there might be a deeper agenda here than just normal history.
We see it as well, like in Hollywood films. One of the most popular ones recently was The Woman King, wasn't it? I don't know if you saw that, where, you know, again, it's about slavery.
I don't watch that rubbish, Mark.
It has, but it's so interesting because it takes the history of this West African kingdom of Dahomey, but it portrays them as abolitionists, where in reality they were the biggest participants in the slave trade. You know, so it's just the anti-historical nature, the anti-factual nature of this agenda, which I find extraordinarily frustrating. But you're doing great work anyway. Thanks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And can I just put out to all readers, do subscribe to the Custodian Substack. It's completely free. And we discuss these sorts of topics. So
yeah, definitely, Zewditu. We will also put a link in our notes below. And if you visit our own website, catholicunscripted.com, you'll find that we've linked the Custodian Substack on ours too. So we definitely want to support the work you're doing. It's wonderful to see you and somebody known to me, a young person with integrity who is fed up of the incoherence and is doing something about it. Because it's all very well talking about it, but you're very actively trying to restore the Christian traditions that we know built this country. So thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully you'll come back again, Zewditu.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye.